Pádraig Míle Buíochas, and I'm delighted also on behalf of the Church of Ireland Centre in DCU and indeed on behalf of the university itself to welcome our wonderful keynote speakers as well as all of you who are in attendance with us here this evening. Now, we're very fortunate to be gathered virtually together this evening to launch the videos made by a group of small Irish primary school leaders talking about the range of experience leading from the middle. That phrase, leading from the middle, was coined by Jeff Southworth in his very interesting study of English primary school leaders, where he compared the styles and the approaches of principals depending on the size of the school they led. He described those who led small schools as leading from the middle because they lead from within the teaching team, and their dual roles of teacher on the one hand and leader on the other hand impact their relationships, their perspectives, and their priorities. Now, the videos we're launching this evening tell some of the stories of leading from the middle in the Irish context. And I want to take this opportunity to join with Pádraig in thanking from the bottom of my heart the school leaders who not only took the time, but took the risk to make these videos. These will provide a wonderful source of advice and support for colleagues and for students and others, and give all of us who are interested in school life and leadership a real insight into the life in small Irish primary schools. I'm also very grateful to the funders and supporters who've made this possible, the Advisory Council of the Church of Ireland Centre in DCU, the IPPN and the Church Education Society. And I also want to thank HBV Studios in Clare Hall for their wonderful work in recording and presenting the videos. Now, we're most fortunate to have two superb exponents of educational leadership in Ireland with us to launch, Dr. Ciara O'Donnell and Patricia Mannix-McNamara. Now, Ciara is well known to all as the former National Director of PDST and has worked in the area of continuing professional development for teachers for 17 years, during which time she held a number of senior leadership positions spanning curriculum, DEIS, school leadership, CPD policy, research and design. And after 8 years as PDST's National Director, she now works as an independent consultant specialising in teacher education, curriculum and school leadership, while also working as a part-time lecturer with Maynooth University. Patricia is the Professor of Education in the University of Limerick's Department of Education and Professional Studies. She holds a Master's and PhD from UL, and her current role is Head of the School of Education. She's also the Director of a very successful postgraduate school leadership programme, PDSL, and is passionate about all things to do with leadership, and I would add, all things to do with collegial relationships. She currently co-hosts a popular sister leadership podcast called Leadership Unwrapped. But it's important to note that both our keynote speakers began their careers as classroom teachers, Ciara in the primary and Patricia in post-primary. So they bring a wealth of deep educational experience to their education with the videos. And I very much look forward to what each of you has to say to us. Now, as you know, we're recording this webinar this evening to enable us to share it with a range of people who wished to be with us this evening, but like myself, are still not able to bilocate a terrible flaw. I just want to take you through our running order. We're actually going to open by playing you a minute and a half from one of our videos from Ballymoney National School, a two-teacher school led by Shireen Rowntree. And I recommend you turn your sound up full for the little clips that we play to ensure you can absolutely hear every element properly. We will then have a discussion with our two keynotes, and we'll finish with another short snippet from a video, this time from St. John's National School in Shannontown, a small school led by Kevin Toomey. We will then engage with the questions and comments that I'm now inviting you all. Please add to the chat box during the discussion and the video, and I'm going to do my absolute best, along with Nora, to keep up with all of those comments. But now I'm going to turn to Nora to ask her to play our first short video clip. And this now is really showing my age. I get to say, roll it there, Nora, please.
Picture of our school. We have just 2 class teachers and 2 special education teachers who are part-time, and 17 families. Parents play an integral part in our school. We don't just include them in a tokenistic way. We need their skills and their input to allow the school to run smoothly. When we originally set up our PTA, rather than exclude anyone, all parents automatically became members of the PTA and are expected to attend meetings. We have no caretaker, so they maintain our school garden and our playground for us. They've fundraised and purchased a polytunnel and a large wooden Astor boat for our playground. Parents model teamwork for our pupils and are such an asset to the school. They're part of our distributive leadership team. As a staff, we focused on creativity during the pandemic. As school tours weren't an option. We created a unique and beautiful 7-meter long bottle top mural out of recycled plastic bottle tops. And it generated a lot of national media attention. The aim of the bottle top mural was to help our 2 classrooms to feel connected to each other. But ultimately, the whole village got involved with collecting the bottle tops, and it ended up uniting the village and our parish.
Now that has given you a very, very small flavour of the content of the videos, just this sense of somebody really speaking out of the passion of their own experience. Now I'm going to turn to our 2 keynote speakers, and I'm going to ask both of you to comment on the way in which the school leaders who recorded those videos talked about their dual role as teachers and leaders, noting how they straddle the boundaries and the links between those 2 key identities. Ciara, can I turn to you first?
Thank you, Anne. Well, yet again, Anne, like, these stories remind us how important it is never to underestimate the remarkable skill and agility of small school leaders in managing those dual professional identities. The phrase leading from the middle, in this case, I suppose, takes on the meaning of a boundary space. And these accounts show that it's not a case of, at any one time, I'm either one or the other. On an average day, every minute of that day, they are sitting on that boundary, straddling both simultaneously. They don't have the luxury of taking one coat off and putting on another. And I think this messy dichotomy is really brilliantly illustrated in these narratives. That kind of precarious balancing act of honouring both roles and then sometimes tolerating the guilt that comes with feeling that sometimes one is neither fully one or the other. Leading from the middle in small schools, it's like that analogy of a leader who's on the balcony and then comes down onto the dance floor. These people are on the balcony and the dance floor at the same time, and they choreograph it beautifully. Like, when I ask myself, listening to these stories, what is their secret? Like, what I'm getting is, rather than rejecting the complexity of having dual identities, they not only accept it as part of the job, and they actually harness it. And they talk about it as opportunities. Like, there was one example there where the principal acknowledged the challenge of maintaining a local character of a school during a merger into an ETB. And while acknowledging the challenge, appreciated the benefits that were going to come from belonging to something bigger. And moving into the pedagogical space, which is the last point I'll make on it, a really great question was posed to one of these teachers. What was it like to be promoted from class teacher to principal? How did that affect your relationship with colleagues? And there was a very special response to that. And that was, because I was being promoted while still retaining a class teacher role, it was easier for me to ask somebody to do something that I was doing myself. So when you're introducing pedagogical change in the classroom, it's always a challenge, right? And it nearly always requires a couple of champions to try something out. Now, if that champion happens to be the school leader trying it out and experimenting and maybe even getting it wrong and leading by example, by being innovative, that's a powerful message. So in remaining one of the staff as a fellow teacher with proximity to the classroom, that gives them a oneness with staff. And it's something perhaps that our administration principals, who are also leaders of learning, don't get that opportunity to do. So these people frame things as a positive, as an opportunity despite the challenges.
Kira, thank you for that. And I'm going to hand over to Patricia, who you get to unmute first, Patricia. And is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, there is, if I could, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm conscious I'm coming as a post-primary educator, so and I do think that's a different lens, but I hope will bring something to the conversation. I expected to hear a lot about how hard the job is, but overwhelmingly it was not that. It was about how amazing the work is, how much it is about building the capacity of the people around them as well as themselves. But one of the pieces around the identity that was really interesting for me was one of the speakers talked about the role being open and it being kind of open for a while and them not going forward, and the buoyancy of their colleagues saying, you should go for this role, you have a lot to give. And they saw her identity as a leader before she saw it in herself. And that's something really fantastic in the profession, that is there among the staff. I thought that was absolutely fantastic. The other was that the challenge that people grapple with, that what we call that living contradiction, that internal dissonance about being a leader and a teacher at the same time. And the identity was primarily teacher. And I say that myself about my own journey. If you ask me in the corridors, what do you do? I say I am a teacher. That's what I am. That's what I will always be. And that comes out so clearly. And the leadership part of the role was a further development of that core identity as teacher that never seems to get lost in that space. And I loved that. One speaker, I hope when you're listening to the podcast, colleagues, talks about their school being built in the 1900s and describes it with love as a TARDIS. You could actually almost feel the connection with building and people and place and children in every sentence that's spoken about from participants. I couldn't stop listening, or I couldn't stop wanting to hear more, because that expression of identity as teacher and then leader comes so clearly from these participants. I think we've a lot to learn from them. So I hope colleagues feel the same.
Patricia, thank you so much for that. I'm actually listing little bits of questions that I may have to ask you both at the end myself at this point. And again, I want to remind people, if anything strikes you out there, people who are listening, add it into the chat box for us. Now, I'm going to move on to another question, and this is both of you wearing the hats that you do, involved in teacher education and leadership and curriculum development and so on. Can each of you comment on the type of professional development that can be tailored to assist people inhabiting those dual roles and identities in small schools? And again, Kira, we'll start with you.
Oh, thank you, Anne. Well, Anne, if there's one belief that unites education research and one that all good professional development supports for school leaders upholds, is this: context is everything. Context matters. And if we respect school contexts like these ones, then we have to cast serious doubts over CPD that are catch-all, once-off transmission kinds of CPDs. There are several contextualized solutions already in existence, whether they are bespoke two-year programs like Mishnock and the mentoring service that forms part of that, stage-specific, I suppose, aspect of leadership development, local support networks like IPPN and Education Centre Network, change maker schools that were mentioned in one of the podcasts, or school-based support, which something like the PDST provides, where the PD actually happens in the school. So it's very, very tailored. But here's the bottom line: learning needs a social life like everybody does. So the mutually and social supportive part of CPD is really important for small school leaders, given their geographical isolation. And the fact that their visibility in the community is so strong that this stark spotlight on them leads to its own pressures. Knowledge sharing and construction among school leaders who share an interest and a context is the most valuable form of professional learning. It's critical that these people have opportunities to share, talk, and gain perspective on challenges that are presented that are not just their own, but that are shared, because gaining perspective is important. It reduces isolation, and a depth of connection and a reflection forms budding communities of practice. And these are driven by agency. And let's not forget, you can't give school leaders agency Agency is something they do electively, and it's core to the key decisions they make about professional learning and whether they want to even engage in it in the first place. And I'll just finish at one point, Anne, before handing over to Patricia. Just a word about the system structures that get in the way here. Like, a suggested model for small schools has always been that a cluster of adjacent schools might get together on the same admin day, right? Where part of the day is devoted to shared learning. Now, that sounds ideal, but the issue of sharing a sub that's thin on the ground militates against this. And then there's a challenge of space. Meaningful professional development can't happen for a small school leader if they got one eye in the classroom and the other eye on an inbox of admin. And you'll remember this, perhaps, Anne, over 20 years ago, Leader and Bolt wrote about the time spent by principals on lower order janitorial tasks, because if they don't do them, who does? And it seems little has changed. There's a sense in these stories of always having to be available and absorbing everybody else's stresses, when in fact you're teaching all day and then you're attending to administrative jobs afterwards. And I know there's a lot of helpful conversations about the moment, particularly by people like IPPN, about sustainability. CPD is part of the tapestry of sustainability. CPD is not something to be squeezed into a space where the noise of the day job gets in the way. CPD is a right. It's an entitlement. It's about re-energizing. It's about renewal. And in fact, within the current structures which prevent space and time for engaging in shared professional conversations, system CPD then has to be about not content. It has to be about giving people space and time to have that shared learning and dialogue.
Thank you, Ciara. Can I hand over to you now, Patricia, and ask you to unmute again, please?
Oh, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more, Ciara. I absolutely couldn't agree more. And I think it's really important that we continue to have that conversation. So I describe what I call interrupt-driven practice. It's where it's so busy. You stop to try and think strategically or to create something that will make the work easier, but you actually, it's faster if you do it yourself, or you're interrupted by something coming at you and you're pulled from what you want to do. And we spend forever trying to learn time management skills and listen to the million books about this to try and help us, without actually seeing systemically the issue. The issue is not individual, it's systemic. And I think you've pointed to that so clearly, as have the school leaders. The CPD that school leaders needs to be context aware, but also needs to be really nuanced around the complexity of leadership. We've come a long way, and thankfully we now have left the hero leader behind, the one charismatic person that's the born leader and nobody else can do it. And we know that we can learn to become better leaders with really effective CPD, and that's really, really important. But what's most important in leadership is, who am I bringing? Who is rocking up as a leader every day? And how do I sustain the health and well-being of that human, as we call it, who is rocking up every day to engage in the leadership? Now, I think that the most important gift we can give ourselves as leaders is mentoring and coaching, and the space to be able to reflect with a guide with you to help you conceptualize how you can actually capitalize on your leadership. So mentoring and coaching are very important forms of CPD that are individual, but we don't think about them as CPD, but they are completely CPD. So that's the first thing I want to raise. The second is and it's really important, we sometimes take different cohorts out for professional development. But if we're going to have real distributive leadership in our schools, where everybody's on the same page, and Ciara, you're so right, you can't give agency to anyone. Empowerment is something that we take on for ourselves, but the context has to be right for us to be able to do that. But there's no point in a principal having CPD about how deputy principals can help them in distributive leadership if the deputy principals are not in the room having exactly the same conversation. So we also need to reconceptualize who we're bringing into the rooms together and cluster CPD in a context specific way. And that would really meet the needs of small schools. One size does not fit all. We know this, we completely know it, but we keep doing it. So the challenge is to really just put the brakes on, have a look at that and see how we can do it differently.
Thank you, Patricia, for those thoughts. Now, I want to relate to the area you're talking about around CPD. Can you comment about how these recordings might contribute to the continuing professional development for other school leaders, the kind of people you're working with all the time? Ciara, I'll come to you again.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm very honest, the kind of tenets of good CPD that I outlined there apply, I suppose, to most schools. What I will say is, though, that what we have noticed with working with small schools is something that that Patricia touched on there, and it is their ability, I suppose, to have those local conversations. Yeah, you know, and the intimacy of their setting allows that shared meaning making, whereby, as you know, Patricia was saying, there isn't that one size fits all, and it's being very, very aware of their own context. And given the limitations that they have, to have a lot of people feeding in, the fact that they only have a small number feeding in can sometimes make that meaning making a little bit easier. So maybe it speaks perhaps to the broader context in saying that smaller cohorts working on, you know, certain priorities can actually help. And I do agree with Patricia's point there about bringing the deputy and the school and the principal together. Remember, in the small schools, that both of these people not only hold leadership roles, but both are classroom teachers. And that makes for a very potent pedagogical and curricular leadership. So take that and build a model of CPD around that shared conversation that has pedagogy at its root.
Thanks, Ciara. And Patricia, again, I hand over to you. How can we use the likes of these recordings in CPD with other school leaders or people who want to be school leaders?
I think there's some very key messages in what people have to say here. The other thing I think we need to say, and it's something that's popped up in the chat and I've just seen it, not every school has a deputy principal as well as a principal. So we need to be aware of even how small some of the schools are. And in that case, that's when it's most vital to have a network of other leaders outside of your school for you to be able to lean on. And certainly one of the participants talks about the care that was given to him from other school leaders in his region, in helping him to actually kind of induct him into the role and into the job and to give him new ways of thinking. It's and one person talked about, so what do you do? And these are the type of things that small network CPD pieces can do for us. How do we have the difficult conversation? It is acute in a very, very small school because the audience or the issue could be 2 teachers or 3 teachers, and one dynamic in that can make work and job satisfaction really difficult for everyone. So even small context specific CPD that looks at how are we in relation to each other, that affective piece of leadership, the emotional intelligence piece, the piece around relationship building, about how we interact with each other, and being able to have courageous, what Brené Brown calls courageous conversations together. That can be really amazing CPD that not only helps work, but gives us back a nourishment and a sustainability, even in our lives as we expand. So these are quite interesting podcasts that in a real kind of appreciative inquiry sort of way give us a good sense of direction on the positives that we need to enhance, and gives us some markers, some ideas for potential on how we can actually do CPD differently. And certainly the best way for us to do CPD for small school leaders is to work with small school leaders to hear what's their vision and what's their need. And I think as the IPPN and certainly the department, it's a really good place for us to keep the conversation hot. I know it's already there, but to keep it on the boil so that we're having a very responsive CPD as opposed to a normative one, where we're telling people this is the CPD that you need, because we only take in the information that we need in the given moment. And that's something we let go of everything else. So that's why it's so important, I think, that our finger's on the pulse there.
Now, some of the things that are coming into the chat box are beginning to point out the strains that people can be under when they're operating in dual roles. And I want to take you into a space that goes more into that whole emotional well-being area. Based on the podcasts, what are your views about the importance of relationships in the context of small schools and tight teams? And Patricia, this time I'm going to start with you.
Okay, I'm not surprised you're starting with me. This is something I'm constantly talking about. So the quality of the relationships that we have as teachers with each other and that we have with leaders has a direct impact on the quality of the relationships that we have with students and the relationships they have with each other. This is a ripple effect, and we need to really think about this in its broadest sense. I certainly have a sense from these podcasts that there are very strong skill sets among teachers and school leaders that are grappling with really complex relationships constantly. And where it's working well, we need to devote time to look at what is it that is working well in this space. And there are aspects where it is not working well. They don't come up strongly here in these, actually, I must say, but certainly across my own research they do. And that's a very difficult place for teachers to be, and a very isolated place for school leaders to be. And it's very hard to be a school leader if you have a disgruntled team and you're trying to maybe engage in change. So what types of supports are we giving in the development of emotional intelligence and in courageous conversations and difficult conversations? That's where the heart of CPD needs to be if we're going to keep school leaders in their roles for long term, because it is that is what creates burnout and stress among school leaders. So I'm really interested in how we create positive climates. And I'm just going to say this little piece, I don't want to hog this, but the culture of teacher talk and leader talk is absolutely core. So what are the types of conversations that I'm having has a direct bearing on the type of culture of relationship that's going to be in my school. Mm-hmm. The hardest thing, and I do this with all of our students in the PDSL, is have a conversation about gossip. What type of talk is tolerated in your space? Because believe it or not, when we do some negative talk with other colleagues, we're hurting ourselves as well as the culture when we do that. That's not to say that we can't say, I'm not happy, this isn't working well, we need to fix it. 100% we do. And conflict can be good. But it's how we manage conflict, how mature we are about it, and how we can move forward productively from the learning of conflict is where we're poorest in our development of this area. So they're my sort of initial thoughts, and I could go on all night. I probably won't.
Thank you, Patricia. Ciara, I'm going to go over to you on that one. What are your views on the importance of relationships in the context of small schools and tight teams?
Okay, I'm going to take my cue from Patricia on the last point she made there about, collective sharing and networking through issues. And that is rooted in having sound relationships. But like Patricia was saying, these conversations have to be honest, authentic, and sometimes they have to be frank. And if they're going to be frank, then it's about creating a kind of a productive disturbance by having challenging conversations in a safe place where there can be healthy debate. It's about allowing ideas to come from anyone, from anywhere. There may be seniority of positions in a school, and I've said this before, but there's no such thing as seniority of ideas. Anybody can offer an idea regardless of their rank or their role. And for that, you need psychological safety, where people feel comfortable with sharing a success without people thinking, they think they're great, or equally sharing something that has gone wrong. And one of the challenges of school leaders is to allow others to learn by doing. And that means sometimes making mistakes. And there can be greater psychological safety in a smaller space for sharing successes and mistakes because of the intimate understanding that small groups allow. Having said that, as Patricia said, sometimes the smallest of the group can make that challenging too. And I'll just make one point about school communities, because that hasn't come up yet in terms of relationships. There's a real sense in these podcasts of school communities, schools as being the beating heart of the community, where there's kind of an intrinsic willingness on behalf of the community to dig in and help out. And when these schools have fewer opportunity to delegate to a larger staff, let's say like other schools might, it does mean that the leaders of small schools sometimes have to delegate maybe to the community, and build strong connections and relations in order to get that help. And parents came up there, prime educators, role models. I was really struck by that podcast that we opened. Parents are part of our distributive leadership team. And in relation to that whole idea of relations, somebody said in one of these podcasts, it was the same girl, recognition that with that support for the community comes responsibility. Many of the examples talk about principals as having a really high visible role in the setting. And that probably increases the demand to lead by example and demonstrate a kind of a pragmatic view of the role that they have. And that's important in terms of maintaining relationships with the community.
Kira, thank you very, very much. Now, I'm actually was caught out there because I'm beginning to take notes from all the things that are coming into the chat box, and there's some really, really interesting stuff coming in. We'll get a chance to deal with in a little while. Now, based on the things that you've said, I'm going to ask you both briefly. What ways do you think positive relationships, particularly for school leaders, can be nourished and enabled to flourish? And I'm going to start with you again, Patricia, please.
I'm going to go back to my comments about coaching, because I certainly have looked at my own career. I would not have understood the value of coaching until I really engaged with it, because I lead a staff of about 69. It's quite busy. And people work very differently. It's high independence, high individuality culture in a university setting, but also high dependency. And so that's quite a complex way of working. And one of the pieces that I learned in coaching was to let go of the fact that I thought that everybody thought the same way as I did and had the same work ethic that I did and had to do it exactly the same way as I did it. And I had to understand that people are very different and work very differently. And coaching really makes you look inwards to see what part of the dance are you dancing and what type of dance is the other person dancing. And to use this metaphor, sometimes if we're keeping things together, we'll waltz together. But sometimes if you need to shake it up, you need to tango while the person is waltzing, because they will expect that they will waltz when they come in to see you as school leader, and you need to be able to move. The other piece around this is, I've learned that we lead differentially, and I think this comes across in these podcasts really well. So the approach that you will take with one will need to be different to the approach that you will take with another. And as the leader, you need to be able to flex between what the needs are of the different people in front of you. So it's less about the static leader and everybody having to respond to how you're rocking up every day. And it's more about that servant leadership way of thinking, which is, how do I respond? What is happening here? And how can I move this in the best way to help everybody to move forward? It may not be the way I want it to move forward, but it is the way that the team will own and sustain it. Because if they move forward the way that I want to, it's not going to be successful. So basically, we're talking about developing a type of relationship that is less ego-centered and more service-centered, and that actually has a high quotient of empathy. And in one of our own podcasts, a colleague of mine, Dr. Nikki Blum, talks about when you engage in empathy, it's not just about being kind to somebody. You need to know a good bit about the other person, how they are, what makes them tick, and what they need in order for you to be able to be an empathic leader. And that shifts the balance really about how we rock up to our leadership every day. So it's very much about connection. And in these podcasts, we hear constantly about connection. So I'm looking forward to hearing more of these, I must say.
Yeah, before I pass over to Kira, I just have to note, Patricia, you keep talking about dancing, moving together, rocking up. I'm beginning to get quite a sense we're going to start dancing later on this evening.
Yeah,
Kira, can you give us just a brief idea about how you think the positive relationships, particularly for school leaders in small schools, can be nourished so they flourish?
Yeah, and I'm going to keep this very short because Patricia has just made amazing points there. I'm just going to talk about self-appreciation and really, really valuing not only what they're doing, but what they are offering the system and the community. I'll give one example. Like, small schools like this are frequently characterized by their flexible and creative approaches to teaching and learning. And I would have to say, when it comes to differentiated, let's say, teaching and learning, small schools and multi-class contexts have written a manual. Like, I mean, the makeup of classes that can have up to 4 classrooms levels in them, they are masters of this. They redefine the rigid structures of age and stage and level ability, and they extend this to the child being at the center. They need to appreciate what they are doing in terms of building that sense of family within the classrooms. One of the quotes that I got from one of the podcasts were, "Respect and the necessity to look out for each other drives every interaction in our classroom." And Patricia there spoke about intimacy. And that reminds me of the whole importance of trust. And trust has got 3 main hallmarks. Credibility, which these people have in spades in terms of their leadership and their pedagogical crossover. Reliability, empathy, and really important, what I heard here, a low sense of self-orientation. That this is not about our position. This is about our service to the position. I'll finish on that because I want to be brief about it.
Now, I'm going to give you both a chance. Have you one key message that you took from these podcasts that you just like to finish your inputs by talking about? Patricia, a key message that struck you.
Okay, so I wrote pages and pages of notes, which I haven't been able to go through, but I have written pages and pages of notes because I was so excited listening. But the point, I think, was, it came up in a few, which is, we all think differently. We're all individuals. We have respect for the dynamics of individuality. We all work differently, and the importance of acknowledging the skills of others. So asking for help, for example, is not always seen as a positive thing. But one of the quotes in the podcast was somebody who had said, there are 4 teachers. That's only 4 brains that I can call on my own. So I have to reach out. And I thought, exactly. So we have to seek, we don't have to say I need help. We can have a musing conversation with somebody who maybe isn't even in the profession, who might have something to offer us, to say, if you were looking at X, how would you think about that? So I loved that sense of celebrating difference, and not wanting sameness, and being okay to be different. The same applies to us as teachers together in the staff room and as leaders as it does for our students.
Thank you, Patricia. And Ciara, finally, key message for you that you heard.
2 words: can do and hope. These podcasts were classic examples of how one's response to a challenge actually determines the outcome. These people operate within a circle of influence, and they just don't seem to allow themselves become disempowered by being at the mercy of the things they can't control. Like I've always said, 90% of success is turning up, just turning up. And these people turn up every day with the unpredictability of what lies ahead of them. If there's one thing you can't delegate as a leader, and that is showing up. And finally, hope. There's nothing more crucial for any school leader than to model hope and to dream and to allow others to dream. And these people are saying to me, we can all have the dream of what John O'Donoghue used to call the brighter fields. And I think these leaders have their brighter fields in plain sight.
Ciara, thank you so much. Now, at this point, I'm going to move us towards a resharing of the screen so that we can play a second clip. And this one ties beautifully with what Ciara has mentioned there about somebody dreaming dreams about how good things can be. This is Kevin Toomey in Shannontown.
We have an autism class since 2019. And I suppose the idea of today is just to tell you a little bit about how integration and inclusion works in our school. It's by no means, a one-size-fits-all effort, but I suppose there's something to be got for every school from it. One of the first and main things that we do here, and has always been the case here, is that we celebrate difference. It's one thing that we do consistently as a school. I suppose we help the children to understand and deal with the fact that we are all different. And especially in our school, in our setting, it would be more unusual to find 2 children from a similar background than 2 children who are from the same background. Like, for example, when it's harvest, we celebrate harvest, we learn about harvest. When it's Easter, we celebrate Easter, we learn about Easter. When it's Eid, we celebrate with our Muslim friends and we learn all about that. Diwali, Chinese New Year, Ridvan, the list goes on all year round. You name it, we'll celebrate it and we learn about it. And I think the children get a lot from learning about one another. They nearly find crack in seeing what each household does differently to their own,
Brilliant.
Okay, you can unshare the screen again there, please, Nora. Thank you very much. Now, I'm at this point, I want to say thank you to our 2 keynote speakers, because I actually want to take a little bit of time to enable them to respond to the loads and loads of material that some people have put into the chat box. Now, what I would like to do is note there were a number of people who made very similar points, and they were points about the lack of time. Now, for example, Breed Calvi talked about the deputy leader in the small schools. You know, where is the deputy principal and others supposed to have these conversations, shared conversations, when there is so little time because of the massive workload? Anne-Marie Newsom was wondering, should we be thinking about the deputy principals having an admin day in the same way that the principals have an admin day? And I just hate to throw in here that we have the additional problem of where exactly are we going to find the subs to cover this? But nonetheless, should we even think about this as additional admin days to support people to have enough time to do some of this talking and thinking and hoping? There were numbers of people who talked about the difficulties. Bridget Dunn had several comments in about how difficult it is to take the step back when you have so little time. So just to get that sense that there are people feeling really, really pressured about time. Ciara, would you comment on what are the ways we can deal with this that aren't going to cause people burnout?
Yeah, I had this conversation very recently with somebody about this, and I was talking to them about those critical opportunities that the principals of these schools need in terms of meeting their deputies. And the conversation was around that they're grabbing moments here and there to have what are actually very important conversations. And I don't have the ideal solution to this, only to say the following, that you owe it to yourselves to really, really prioritize important meetings like this. Even if it's only a half an hour, to promise yourselves that perhaps even once a week, outside of the noise, make that commitment to you, and not even a short span of time where it's focused, where you keep the agenda small rather than wavering. And, you know, again, commit to saying by the end of this half hour, even a half an hour, we will have had a meaningful conversation about this. And I honestly believe, and I suppose I'm guilty of procrastination myself an awful lot of the time, that if something is written down and committed to, it is more likely to happen. And if by the end of that meeting or interaction, that a commitment is made, that something will happen, not that, oh, look, we'll pick up this conversation later. No, the conversation doesn't finish until a commitment is made that we will follow up with such and such. Now, I'm not talking about 2 or 3 hour meetings. I'm talking about short meetings that have these boundaries around them, that for that amount of time, this is the most important thing for us. And again, I'm not saying that's the ideal solution, but it's prioritization, I suppose, but prioritization without having to have a long, extensive erosion, I suppose, into other things.
Ciara, thank you. Patricia, how do you respond to that whole thing around the pressure of time and more demands and the impact on people's well-being?
So we did a CPD evening yesterday with the Women in Leadership Network, and we had to fill out a survey, and it was teachers and they had to fill out a survey, and you got a typology. Now, I don't agree with all of these, but most of the teachers got superhero as their typology, which is want to do everything, want to do it brilliantly, want it to be perfect, we'll keep going until it's perfect, and we'll overwork until they fall down to make sure that it's perfect. And that's the first thing we have to let go of. So it's really hard to let go of the standard to say it must be perfect and to accept that good enough is good enough. So we have to shift our thinking a bit about what is okay and what we can manage instead of having to be perfect. I thought after COVID, we wouldn't roll back into having to do absolutely everything that we didn't do during COVID and some, but we did. And we did double because we did all the stuff that we missed, rather than seeing ourselves as finite. You know, that what is it, the 40,000 weeks or whatever that book is that talks about time is finite. And we need to think and prioritize more clearly about what we're willing to put that finite energy into. We have to let go. We've done a huge change process in our own curriculum in our university recently. And one of the colleagues brought in a piece of work by someone that said, what are you going to let go of if you want to actually do something else? And that needs to be absolutely burned in our brains as leaders. We cannot just keep adding. And the same as Ciara, very sharp focus on what is the thing that we want to look at. I love to talk to people. I love to have a cup of tea and find out what's going on with them. I want to know how their kids are. I want to know how their mom is. I want to hear what they've done recently and what they're watching on Netflix. I can't ask any of that. I need to be very focused. And then what we do, if this is any help to colleagues, is we create one action item, and that action item sits until, and no other action item is going to come in on top of that until that action item is moved forward. So it's almost a change in how we work. You can still have the good relationships, but they're at lunchtime and at coffee time. But when we're actually doing our sharp focus, if we cut through some of the pieces that we need to, it doesn't damage the relationship, it enhances it, because people trust you more because the work is actually getting done.
Yeah, and to respond to both of that, while you were speaking, Breed Calvi put into the chat box, I do organise tea session at Eashgale time to discuss school with DP. That was IPPN's suggestion and hugely beneficial, but I feel so much was not touched on. And I'm tying it back to something that Caroline Good said earlier about how they had used 15-minute meetings, obviously very, very short meetings pre-school, and had a little WhatsApp group to stay in touch. And my sense from what Caroline put in was they were prioritizing, look, these are the key things we got to talk about and we got to WhatsApp about. You want to comment on any of that?
I think it's really good advice. I think that the most protected time that's so important in the school leadership is the relationship with the deputy principal, if there is one, or who is your team, who are your leadership team. I don't like using the word management team because I think that's got a connotation of something different. And if you lose that connection of those meetings, you lose your vital support. Because sometimes they will say to you, go for it, that's a brilliant idea. But sometimes they'll say to you, don't go within 400 weeks of that, because that's a really bad idea. And you need that within your team. That's really, really important. And these conversations can be had walking. They don't necessarily have to be these formal meetings. They can be, we need to do yard duty. Will you be on with me so that we can do that piece of work? There are different ways, different small connections that we can make to protect time, but we need to be very tough with ourselves about holding to those times. And I don't want to sound expedient, because the relationship is really, really important. But, it's, and the other thing that we need to think about is, and I say this to all, is that schools are very unique workplaces. They're not like any other workplace on the planet, because they don't have the resources that other workplaces do. They don't have the secretarial support. They don't have the HR mobilization behind them. They don't have all the things that other organizations have. So being sharp in our focus about having those systemic pieces protected is very, very important for us in our work.
Yeah. I'll actually come in on that, Anne, if I can, because I see in the chat there that was beneficial to have those short meetings. And this Breed is saying, but I feel so much was not touched on. And I can really relate to that as well. And I suppose what I used to say to myself, what I still say to myself in those situations is, I simply will not touch on everything. And a mantra that I've used myself, if it's helpful, is must, should, and could. At this time, what are the absolute musts? And that the should and the coulds are all right, but the must should never be at the mercy of the shoulds or the coulds. And sometimes when you have a long amount of time to discuss something, it's amazing maybe that time is probably not used as well, maybe, as having a targeted time where there are boundaries and there is that, and I suppose intrinsic pressure. Because sometimes when we've got too much time, for something, you can actually get into the thick of thin things, as opposed to having a focus time and just focusing on the musts. And you feel an awful lot better having having dealt with something that's really, really tangibly meaty, rather than having butterflied over a number of things and maybe not nailed any one of them.
Yeah, thank you both for that. What I've also noted from chat boxes, a number of people have agreed with you, Patricia, on the benefits of coaching, and other people, including Caroline Flood, was talking about kind of strategic use of Croke Park hours because everybody was on board to work together. But one of the things that has also come in from Lorna Keaveney is the problem that the department create by treating small schools as if they're the same as big schools and giving everybody exceedingly short notice in a 2-teacher school where leader is a full-time teacher about, say, for example, curriculum evaluations or other urgent paperwork that suddenly needs to be returned yesterday. And that is something that is outside the structure of the school, but it's also not something that you can put into the should or could. You have no option but to put that into the must box. What do we do when the department, who are supposed to love us all equally, are forgetting the additional work that is a reality of life in the small school? Ciara, I'll go to you first because you've dealt with lots of this.
Yeah, these are the things that come from left field, aren't they? These are the things that find themselves into the urgent and important box, despite the fact that we've been ahead of ourselves and keeping things tipping over. I think there's room for a certain amount of pragmatism here, and also I think room for a certain amount of, hang on a minute, we can only do what we can do here. I'm not suggesting that, you know, that it's jettisoned in any way, but that perhaps a certain portion of that work can be attended to, but with the understanding of that I'm only one person, we're only a small network here, and the reality of getting that notice when I got it, is I suppose not taking any account of the current pressures I have. It's what Stephen Covey calls quadrant 3, which it's somebody else's priority but not mine, and then it becomes my priority and it becomes my problem. And I think, I know this probably sounds very obvious, but the more that the messages of frustration around these kind of things are fielded back to great organizations like the IPPN and the unions, the better. These messages can't be said enough.
Patricia, is there anything you'd like to add on that?
I want to agree completely with this. And actually, I was working with my own team recently and saying, I need your dissent to support me. I need you to go in this route while I go in this route, because I need this to be uncomfortable for people so that we can get a change in relation to this. So I agree with Ciara completely. So the more that we can actually just show without being really up there, but really just putting out there, and certainly in COVID, we saw a lot of this lastminute.com messaging to principals, which was just awful for people to try and manage, and certainly depleted any leaves that people had. So there was no break to be had for a lot of school leaders, and I remember writing about that at the time. So that's one. I think using the voice agentically, as Ciara has said, around this in the right forums to put the pressure up the system is really important. But the other thing is to become comfortable, and I've learned this from coaching, and I certainly, it was a task that a coach gave me. I nearly lost my life when he said it to me. He said, drop the ball on something, Patricia. And I was, I couldn't possibly. And he said, strategically drop not something big, but drop the ball on something, and then get used to what that feels like, and then get used to dropping the ball, because you are not going to be able to do everything.
Absolutely.
And it taught me how to choose what to prioritize. And I now say to my team very clearly, like I've said before, what are we letting go of? We need to drop that if we're going to put our energy into that. And it's all of our energy, all hands at the tiller on this one. And I know that you want to build a new school tomorrow, but we won't build a new school tomorrow. We'll actually make the returns to the department tomorrow like we have to do. And then we'll pick up the agency around the building on Wednesday. So it's that type of just managing and getting comfortable with not achieving everything all the time, because a lot of the time management literature is telling us now, the busier you are, the better you are at achieving your to-do lists, the more busy you are going to become. It is really something that mobilizes and escalates. You don't ever control the to-do list or the busyness. You will give people more space to put more stuff on you the minute you clear the pieces that you're doing. So it's difficult. It's not easy. There's no easy answer, as Ciara has said on this one, but the voice is very important on it.
Yeah, I can see too in the chat box, Sonia Burgess has decided she loves the phrase tolerating the guilt. And I think you've talked even more about it there, Patricia. And Bridget Dunn is talking about how the principal has to prepare even more for the short meetings and everyone else expects the principal to have the answer. And I'm wondering, Bridget, if what Patricia has just said there about strategic dropping of the ball occasionally is a helpful way to get across to people that no, actually, the principal doesn't have to have all the answers all the time. Now, Caroline Good, and Caroline, I know I can always rely on you to come in with all these really, really interesting, fast typed comments. She's talking about the advantage of the small school is you have a team where you can liaise with much more quickly because everybody knows everybody and it's easier to get people together. Now, we're a minute to 8. There was one point that Deirdre O'Connor from the INTO put into the chat box right at the start. And she was reflecting on the constraints, Ciara, that you had talked about, that, you know, and how surprised you were they hadn't featured more in the podcasts. And she's wondering what the podcasts might help with learning for these clusters of schools in the current pilot project. Now, I'm not sure, Ciara, whether yourself and Patricia know about the current pilot project. And sadly, Pádraig has disappeared from us because he has to be elsewhere, but there are small clusters of schools in a pilot project working together around sharing and exploring what's possible collectively. Have you any comment to make at all about how podcasts like these could feed into a project like that? Patricia, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, at the risk of saying the wrong thing, and I hope I'm not here now. So I am a little familiar with what's happening, but not enough in relation to these. And I do think there is a lot to be gained from these cluster pilots. They're time consuming. I just need to say that. And I think it adds to the busyness of the road. So I do have a little critical piece in relation to that. I have another piece, which is that when we find solutions, and I say this to my own team all the time, when we find solutions by adding to our work and creating more time and trying to find them, we sometimes take the pressure off the system to support. It becomes our problem as opposed to a systemic problem. So I have a little bit of an unease about it, just to say that to you. That notwithstanding, I hugely believe there's a lot to be learned from clustering with other schools. I believe that the boundaries of our schools need to be more porous. I think we need to have more fluid movement between schools. I mean, for sharing of knowledge between teachers now. I don't mean students hopping between schools, but and I think that's very important. I would keep my eye on the impact of being that solution focused, and that we don't allow a system to abdicate its responsibility for poor resourcing of our schools. And I'll probably leave it there.
Patricia, thank you. Ciara, anything you'd like to?
Yeah, I'll say very, very quickly. Again, I'm a great believer in that kind of community of practice type model of professional development. Sometimes, I suppose, over the last couple of years, I've become a little bit cautious about the way the word clusters are being used, because my understanding of a model like that is that it can be coordinated from the top, but it needs to be engineered from the bottom up. And the question I ask is, what is the purpose of these? Anything that's put together like this, we have to dig down into what is the purpose, right? And I think it's important that these clusters are not shrouded as a top-down agenda, when the whole idea of having that kind of gathering of professionals is that it is engineered bottom up for the benefit of the people who are taking part in it. And I'll finish by saying that conversations like this evening and the whole catalogue of podcasts that you have, that the IPPN and DCU have gathered here, that learning has to be captured, because that is real stuff. That is the authentic beating heart of the profession talking.
Ciara, thank you so much. Now, I just want to note that I'm beginning to see people doing that professional learning community thing in the chat box, where they're beginning to talk to one another rather than us, which is fantastic, about things like teacher-pupil ratio and retaining teachers and so on. And what it shows me is that there certainly is the need for those opportunities for people to engage collectively across schools that may not be being provided sufficiently. And I also noted a past student of mine, Killian Hales, who is thoroughly enjoying the advice from colleagues. And I think that's a great point for us to move towards the end. And they're really taken with this tolerating the guilt. They're loving that one. Martha Wilmington is also now extremely pleased with that phrase.
Can I just say on that, Anne, when I mentioned that, it wasn't that I meant that was okay. at all. At all, because as somebody rightly said, that kind of stuff would not be accepted in any other profession. Really, what I meant was that it is a case sometimes of having to live with neither being fully one or the other.
Yeah, and that balancing act all.
Yeah.
And there's the most wonderful thing here from Jill Horn. She says, thank you, not feeling as lonely in tolerating the guilt. And I think this opening up, the chat box is actually a very useful way for people to connect with one another. Now, it is now 8:04. So at this point, I am going to conclude this evening's webinar. And what I would like to do, first of all, is thank most warmly Patricia and Ciara, our two fabulous keynote speakers, and we have been so blessed to have you. And the rest of you who are all out there listening have no idea the hoops that had to be jumped through technically just to get Ciara into this Zoom. It kept wanting to push her out. They clearly think you're a Russian bot or something. Well, thank God you got here, because you were fabulous, as were you, Patricia. We have been most blessed with you both sharing your insights and your expertise and your time, not just with this webinar, but all of the time I know you both put into preparing for this, in engaging with each one of those podcasts. I'm so grateful to everybody who has attended, who has contributed in the chat just by being there and engaging. A few people have even sent me texts and WhatsApp, so there's a lot of engagement out there. I would also particularly again like to express my deepest appreciation to the school leaders who recorded the Leading from the Middle videos. You have been wonderful. We will let word out to everybody very quickly about where those are going to be available, but they are available for sharing freely with everybody. And the recording of this is also available for anybody who was unable to attend tonight and is interested. And finally, I would just like to say the warmest thanks to colleagues in the IPPN. Ye are fantastic supporters and collaborators with our little centre at the Church of Ireland Centre in DCU, and an absolute joy to work with, and the calmest, most wonderful of people, Nora and Jennifer and Jack, absolutely fantastic. Can I say good night, everybody? Thank you all again so very, very much for this really, really instructive and interesting evening. And I think we can now declare those podcast videos open or launched. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Anne. Thank you.